Kalispera says, good evening. Good evening, everyone. Let me start by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome to tonight's online seminar, which will be delivered by Professor Alexander Kitroeff on the Greek Orthodox Church of America. Allow me to go through some housekeeping items before we venture into tonight's seminar. We would like to thank the sponsor of tonight's seminar, Georgia Pedizis, and I invite you all to become sponsors of a seminar of your choice. It's only a tax-deductible $100 donation. Furthermore, let me remind you all that our April seminars will be all online with international speakers, as we forfeit the use of the mezzanine level, as the Greek Center is one of the venues of the Comedy Festival. Look up the program. There are quite a few appealing acts. We've got a break next Thursday due to Greek Easter and return online on Thursday, the 28th of April, with Professor Tom Papadimitriou on the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople and the Ottomans. And just a reminder for those that have any questions during our Q&A interval, simply submit them through the chat or comment section on Facebook or YouTube. Let's get to tonight's seminar. The emergence of the modern Greek nation state was to an extent a project of modernity driven by Greek intellectuals in the diaspora, having understood from the experience in the West that the nation state and not the empire was becoming the dominant mode of social and political organization. Their aim was to create a territorial entity, a new independent administrative unit that was free from Ottoman control but attached to the West. Their chief aim was the invention of a national culture, an imaginary field of shared sentiments, beliefs, and symbols to replace the ethno-religious identities of the Ottoman Empire. With this collective national consciousness, the Greek-speaking Orthodox subjects of the Ottoman Empire came to regard themselves as fellow citizens of the nation-state rather than co-religionists of the Orthodox millet. Though they remained Orthodox Christians, their religious beliefs constituted not their entire identity, but one dimension of their national consciousness. In the differentiated order of modernity, religion simply served one function, the meeting of spiritual needs. However, like many projects of modernity, it remained incomplete and did not lead to faithful duplication of Western models. These imports were often resisted by strong indigenous forces, such as the church, oligarchic elements, and clientelistic practices of social relationships. In the formation of the modern Greek diaspora, we see these tensions at play, and antagonistic overtures characterize not only the early history, but the ongoing history of many Greek communities in the modern diaspora. The conflict and rivalry between lay communities and the church characterize the history of most diaspora communities, where the church, struggling to shed its millet-style convictions, often seeks to exert influence and authority on Greek migrants beyond the religious domain. Which leads us to the Greek Orthodox Church of America, the subject of our seminar tonight, which is perceived an example of a church that has achieved this multifaceted dominance. The establishment of the Greek Orthodox Church in America began in the beginning of the 20th century, coinciding with the acceleration of immigration from Greece, and it grew at an intensified rate during the first few decades of last century. Today, it boasts more than 500 parishes, and it dominates the Greek American landscape. In the US, the parish has replaced the community organization as a hub of Greek American cultural and social life, and has remained so because it's managed to adapt so as to serve the needs of the increasingly Americanized faithful. To tell us about this journey, about the challenges and issues along the way, and about the present state of affairs, we welcome back Professor Alexander Kitroeff. Professor Kitroeff, bit on his background, was born in Athens and educated in the UK, where he received his doctorate in modern history from the University of Oxford. He is currently Professor of History at Haverford College in Pennsylvania and has taught at several other institutions, including the Center for Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies at Queen's College and the NASA Center for Hellenic Studies in New York. He served on the editorial board of the Journal of Hellenic Diaspora from 1980 through 2013, when the journal ceased publication. His research focuses on identity in Greece and its diaspora, in a broad range of topics on which he has published extensively. His most recent books are The Greeks and the Making of Modern Egypt, published as 19, which has also been published in Arabic and in Greek, and more recently, The Greek Orthodoxy in America, A Modern History. And you'll see links to that book in our email notification. Professor Kitroeff has also collaborated with film director Maria Iliou as a historical consultant in several documentary films. Currently, he's working on 2 book projects, A History of the American Hellenic Education Progressive Association, also known as AHEPA, to mark the organization's centenary in 2022, and also A History of Greek-owned diner restaurants in America. Professor Kitroeff, the floor is yours. Welcome once again.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, Nick. Thank you to the community in Melbourne for the invitation. I'm very glad to be back with you in one of these seminars. What a wonderful series of seminars you are organizing. It's really, I think, a model for the rest of the Greek diaspora communities throughout the world. So congratulations, and it's an honor to be part of this program. Thank you, Nick, for the logistics as well. Thank you to Kostas for the background tech support. What I will do today is I will really segue from that wonderful introduction about the role of the church in America that Nick has just presented, and I will try and explain by giving an overview of the history of the church in America, try and explain how it acquires this dominant role. And for that purpose, I will be sharing my PowerPoint presentation. I've got about 20 or so slides, and we'll take you through this topic of the history of the church in America. Although mass migration to the United States started late in the 19th century, around 1890, and the big wave of 400,000 Greeks went to America from the 1890s through to the 1920s, when America started restricting emigration. The presence of Greeks was earlier. This slide on the left is the first Greek Orthodox Church established in the United States in New Orleans in the 1860s, at a time when there were Greek merchant houses, exporters of cotton and other goods. We have a merchant presence in the United States, in New York and in New Orleans at the time. So this is the first Greek Orthodox Church. The building doesn't exist anymore. There is obviously a more modern church. When the Greeks started arriving in the 19th century, there was already the presence of Russian Orthodox churches in America, and in many instances, not having anywhere else to go in terms of worship, the Greeks went to churches which had congregations which were made up not only of Russians, but Greeks and also other Slavic Orthodox immigrants. But it was very clear that the Greeks wanted to separate themselves, have their own churches, and not be under the Russian Orthodox Church, and started to establish their own churches. It was a process which was done in a kind of rule of thumb way. There were people writing back to their villages, asking for the village priest to send someone over to wherever they had settled in the United States. There were self-appointed priests who arrived in America and went around looking for places where they could serve as priests. And gradually, Greek Orthodoxy became established, although not in a very organized way. This was a period of xenophobia in the United States, 1890s, early 20th century, but there was an acceptance. If there wasn't an acceptance of the Greeks who were not considered white, there was nonetheless several Christian communities who welcomed the Greeks, albeit considering them different because they were Eastern Orthodox, but there was a welcome on the part of Christian communities to for the Greeks arriving in the United States. And the most interesting of all these phenomena are the case of South Omaha. South Omaha in 1909 experienced what is known as the greatest anti-Greek pogrom in the history of the United States. Luckily, there was no loss of life, but 3,000 Greeks were forced out of South Omaha in a big riot that followed a misunderstanding. A Greek was dating an American girl, and that triggered a xenophobic explosion in the town of Omaha, and these Greeks were expelled. The fascinating thing is, this happened in 1909. The fascinating thing is that 6 years later, as you can see from the slide on the right, the local newspaper, the Omaha Sunday Bee, features a full-page explanation of the presence of the Greek Orthodox in America. And this is something that I have uncovered in my research. I think we all knew about the 400,000 Greeks arriving and facing xenophobia right through to the 1920s. But the surprising thing is that where Greek Orthodoxy was concerned, America was more welcoming and more tolerant. Nonetheless, the experience of ad hoc formation of parishes, of not necessarily qualified priests arriving from Greece, not necessarily qualifying is actually a euphemism. In some cases, they were imposters who presented themselves as priests. The difficulties of getting priests over from Greece or Asia Minor, as the case was, meant that there needed to be some streamlining. And here steps in one of the most important figures of Greek Orthodoxy in the 20th century, Meletios Metaksakis, who at the time of World War I was Archbishop of Athens and Greece. He subsequently becomes the founder of the Archdiocese in America. He comes over to the United States to try and organize the church and find a way of the church acquiring a central governance. He then becomes ecumenical patriarch. This is in 1920-21. He is kicked out of Constantinople by the Turks in 1922 at the time of the Asia Minor disaster. He becomes Patriarch of Alexandria and serves until the 1930s. A British diplomat who met Metaksakis in Alexandria described him in the best way possible as a Venizelos in robes. Indeed, Metaksakis, a Cretan, as his last name suggests, was a close associate with Venizelos, both in a personal way and in a political way. And that's why when Venizelos lost the elections of 1920, he was dismissed as Archbishop of Athens. He left. He didn't accept his dismissal, but came over to the United States and decided that the many parishes needed a central organization, and he establishes the Archdiocese in America. There's a meeting in 1921 where the establishment is agreed upon. Officially, it's May 17 of 1922 is the date that the central governing body of the Greek Orthodoxy in America, the Archdiocese, was formed, 17 May 1922. So, of course, the Archdiocese is commemorating its centenary. It is called Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America, a title it maintained until 1996. But for all intents and purposes, the main work of the Archdiocese was in the United States. The Greeks in Canada acquired significant numbers only after World War II, and the Greeks in South America remained the communities there were much, much smaller than the presence of the Greeks in the United States. The first archbishop that Mataksakis actually appoints is Archbishop Alexandros, also identified with Venizelist politics. Throughout the 1920s, despite the fact that we have a central organization, the Archdiocese, Archbishop Alexandros is unable to prevent the church becoming divided between royalists and Venizelists. This, of course, is the time of the Greek political national schism, the argument, the conflict between King Constantine and Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos over what side Greece should join during World War I, which breaks out in 1914. And in 1915, King Constantine dismisses Venizelos as prime minister. And from that moment onwards, right through to World War II, Greek politics and society is polarized between royalists and Venizelists. The reflection of the royalist-Venizelist schism in the United States is really quite surprising in terms of its intensity, and suggests, of course, that the Greek immigrants, although at the time they were deciding that they would be settling permanently in the United States, nonetheless maintained very, very strong ties with the homeland and its politics. However, I should note that in a diplomatic report sent from Washington to Athens, Greek ambassador Charalambos Simopoulos explains to the foreign ministry of Greece that it's not so much clergy who are Venizelists or royalists, but it's actually the constituencies. It's persons in the church who, in a sense, decide to, it's the lay members of the church who have a particular preference. So if they suspect that the priest is not sympathetic with their own political preference, they will either clash with the priest or actually leave and follow and establish their own parish. So in the 1920s, we have an increasing number of parishes established in the United States because in some cases the royalists decide to go off and create their own church, or the Venizelists do that. The best example of all is the creation of St. Eleftherios Church in New York City, which is currently still operating. It's in the Chelsea section on the Lower West Side of Manhattan. And of course, it was the Venizelists who left Holy Trinity Cathedral and established a church called St. Eleftherios, Venizelos' first name, of course. So the 1920s were a very troubled decade, and the Greek diplomatic authorities, the Greek Church, the Ecumenical Patriarchate were trying to find ways of bringing the arguments and the rift to an end, because the Greek Church was getting a very bad press. There were clashes in churches. Police sometimes was invited to break up the scuffles that took place. It was really quite a very negative image that the Greeks were presenting. The solution found was to force Alexandros to step down and to appoint Archbishop Athenagoras, who was enthroned in 1931. Athinaguaras was a very charismatic, dynamic figure who was welcomed by both royalists and Venezuelists and the media and almost everyone among the Greek American community when he arrives in New York. The sense one gets from reading the reports is that the Greeks themselves were fed up with the divisions that had taken place, the bad name that the Greeks were getting because of the divisions in the church, and they all welcomed Athenagoras. Athenagoras came to the United States with a very, very specific agenda. Athenagoras' view was that because the communities who ran the churches, the local communities, had been either identified with the Venezuelists or the royalists, the solution was to make the parishes independent from the community, which was a very novel way of going about things. As far as I know, at the time, the other very big community, diaspora community, the Greeks in Egypt, had the classic model that we know, which was that the community administered the church. Well, Athenagoras says this has got to come to an end. The parishes will be the parishes will be governed by the archdiocese, and the local community organizations will have to accept the fact that the parish will become dominant. So the board that runs the parish will be the dominant local organization in America. In a sense, the community had to sign over its prerogatives and its rights and become part of the parish. So in a sense, the local priest becomes the head of the local community. And by the same token, the church assumes responsibility for running the Greek language schools and also enacting the philanthropic activities which were assigned to the ladies of the community, the ladies Philoptochos. So this is the fundamental transformation that takes place. It's the crisis in the 1920s that allows the ecumenical patriarchate and the religious authorities to find an opening and establish in a very important way and in a very clever way, in some strategically very astute way, establish the dominance of the church. Not all communities accept this change. There are many communities in which there is a dual existence between community and parish, but gradually most communities agree to the arrangement in which the parish becomes dominant. Part of the success is due to the extraordinary charismatic personality of Athenagoras, who, as soon as he arrives, one of the first things he does is he goes to the White House to meet the president. He's also got good relations with subsequent presidents, and in the 1940s acquires what, as the photograph suggests, a very, very close relationship with President Harry Truman from 1945 onwards. President Truman is close to Athenagoras also not only for personal but for political reasons, because of the outbreak of the Cold War, the United States is suddenly paying attention to the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople and is concerned that Russian Orthodoxy or Greek Orthodox leaders who would be pro-Russian might become ecumenical patriarchs when the time comes for a new patriarch. So Truman and the State Department behind the scenes, when the ecumenical patriarchate position comes up for renewal, well, the former patriarch passes away, the United States acts in ways which will enable the election of Athinagoras as Patriarch of Constantinople, with the full support of President Truman. And he does fly to Constantinople on the presidential plane to take up his position as ecumenical patriarch. He leaves the United States having already established the church as the dominant institution. However, the 1950s are a period of assimilation. There has been relatively little emigration from Greece from the 1920s onwards. There's going to be a small increase in the 1950s, but generally, with a lack of renewal of immigrants from Greece, the Greek American community is steadily assimilating, acquiring upward social mobility. The Greek American historian Theodore Saloutos calls the 1950s the age of Greek American respectability. It's when the Greeks enter the mainstream. And when the Greeks enter the mainstream, Greek Orthodoxy faces a dilemma, because Greek Orthodoxy, if anything, is based on tradition, on the Greek language liturgy, on connections with the old world. And it has to adapt. And it adapts successfully. Athenagoras' successor, Archbishop Michael, who was formerly the Archbishop Theatiron in Britain, arrives in the United States and very carefully calibrates a balance between preserving the Greekness and the Greek language, but allowing the use of English, which becomes a very, very important point of contention in the relationship between the church and its constituents. Goya is the Greek Orthodox Youth Association, and what Michael does is he forms a youth organization, and because, of course, all the youth organization is made up of persons who were born in the United States and are more comfortable with English, he allows Goya to speak English. And this is the first of several moves that the church will do to try and open up to what is becoming more and more an English-speaking Greek American constituency. Another successful move is that the Greek Orthodoxy, this is, of course, the time, there's two things happening in the United States. Because of the Cold War, Greek Orthodoxy is favored over Russian Orthodoxy. That's one thing, and we saw that in the case of Athenagoras' election to the ecumenical patriarchate. The other thing is there's a religious revival in the United States in the 1950s. It's a reaction to World War II and the horrors of World War II. There's a move towards spirituality. Religion becomes very important in the United States. And and although it's really Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism which are more prominently discussed in the United States, along with them, Greek Orthodoxy becomes recognized. And we have this very, very important event that Archbishop Michael is invited to offer prayers at the inauguration. This is the second inauguration of President Dwight Eisenhower, seen on the left. And of course, many of you will recognize Vice President Richard Nixon on the right of this slide. So this is a highlight moment. And from then onwards, we have Greek Orthodox archbishops involved in some way or another with invocations and prayers during the inaugurations of American presidents. Yet another sign that the church has become not only the dominant institution of Greek America, but is also being recognized more and more by mainstream America, which of course enhances its status among Greek Americans. But nothing compares with the tenure of Archbishop Iakovos from 1959 to 1996, the most, with all due respect and apologies to Athinaguaras, Archbishop Iakovos is the most prominent figure of Greek Orthodoxy in America in the 20th century. Archbishop Iakovos was born on the island of Imbros. As a teenager, he witnesses the island being handed over to the Turks. He actually somewhere has a memoir where he's looking as a child to some kind of government building, and he sees the Greek flag being taken down and the Turkish flag being raised, and that remains indelibly in his mind and will influence the way that he will comport himself as an archbishop. Importantly, he has served as in the Boston area already in the 1950s. He's then gone to the World Council of Churches, so he is a archbishop with a very good grasp of the realities of America. Just as well, because he has to face in the 1960s and 1970s tumultuous changes that sweep through both the United States and Greek America. And I've got this kind of palimpsest slides here that sum them all up. On the left, you see Martin Luther King giving his "I Have a Dream" speech in the Oval, in Washington D.C. On the right, you see the junta, establishment of the junta, the takeover of the establishment of a dictatorship in 1967 in Greece. Bottom left is one of the ships that start bringing Greeks over to the United States. From 1965 onwards, the doors of America open up and we have a new wave of Greek emigration, about 75,000, maybe 100,000 people arrive in the United States through the 1970s. So now suddenly the Greek Orthodoxy, which was Greek Orthodox constituency, which was Americanizing, now acquires a more Greek-oriented element. And this is when we have the establishment of Astoria, the Greek town in New York. On the right is Frank Lloyd Webber's, the architect's rendition of the Greek Orthodox Church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the most modern expression we have. Most of Greek Orthodox churches are Byzantine style, but Iakovos and the leaders of Greek Orthodoxy are happy to approve this space-like design of the very modernist design of the church. For me, the fact that they accepted the church to have particular shape meant that Greek Orthodoxy was adapting to the modernity. But Iakovos has a great deal to deal with: the civil rights movement, the situation in Greece, the political situation in Greece, the influx of Greek-speaking immigrants, but the modernization of Greek America. How is he going to deal with that? Well, the thing that he repeats throughout the 1960s is, we are no longer an immigrant church. There's a typo there, no longer an immigrant church. In other words, we are now a church which is an American church. So what he does is, on the left, you can see a New York Times item that reports that at the clergy laity conference that's taken place in Denver, Colorado in 1964, he announces the decision that the Greek Orthodox Church can use some limited English in the liturgy. It's a major step. He's going to take other steps which will be controversial. At that time, that is accepted. The influx of Greeks hasn't quite started in 1964, so that's acceptable. The other thing he does is he marches on the side of Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama in March 1965 during a very famous civil rights march. Martin Luther King invited leaders of churches to join him down in Selma. And to his credit, Iakovos was the only leader of a church who went down to Alabama and marched on the side of Martin Luther King. Needless to say, most of the Greek American community were horrified because most Greeks were either prejudiced or were too worried that having gone through xenophobia and finally become accepted by the mainstream in America, associating themselves with blacks and the civil rights movement might put them back into a vulnerable spot. So there was a great deal of criticism of Iakovos, but Iakovos stood firm. There's a wonderful interview he gives and talks about when he was marching with Martin Luther King and he saw the National Guard, armed National Guard on either side of the march that he was engaged in. He kind of imagined that these were Greeks marching and the people on either side were the Turkish army. He had those Greek-Turkish images always in his head. Things didn't go as well for Iakovos in his next big concession to Americanization when he actually declared that the liturgy could be done in English if locally the priest would decide that it was more beneficial to the constituency because most of them knew English. He does that at the Clergy Laity Conference in the 1970s, in 1970, and the crisis goes on throughout the 70s. Not a good idea to suggest it in New York, because New York, of course, by now is the capital of the Greek language influx, the Greek language newspaper. There's a huge reaction. People suspect that Iakovos is trying to Americanize the church too quickly, eradicate its Greekness. Nothing of the sort, but nonetheless, there was a huge reaction, and Iakovos had to, for one of the few times in his career, had to retreat a little bit. As the French say, it was a retreat. He retreated in order to attack more effectively, and that's what he did. He initially retreated, and then the language was the liturgies were permitted to take place in English. And after the first wave of protests, things calmed down by the mid-70s. The other important way that Iakovos established the significance of the church was his role in the Greek American lobbying efforts that took place from beginning with the invasion of Cyprus by the Turkish forces, which meant that the Greek Americans reacted to the attitude of the United States, I'm using my words carefully, to the apathy of the United States, to the implicit support of the United States for Turkey's action. We had a huge movement among the Greek Americans with the help of Greek American and other congressmen. And in the end, the US Congress imposed the Turkish arms embargo. It forced the American government to stop selling arms to Turkey for 3 years in retaliation for the illegal use of American supplied arms in the invasion of Cyprus. Iakovos was a major figure in the lobbying organizations. You see a memorandum from the President Ford papers on the left listing Iakovos as one of the participants of a conversation in the White House. Ultimately, the embargo was lifted by President Carter in 1978, which in many ways, the Greek Americans turned away from Carter, and I would say the Democratic Party as well. But of course, Iakovos was too smart for that. He maintained good relations with the White House, even though he criticized Carter for lifting the embargo. And in 1980, he becomes the first Greek American to receive the very, very prestigious Presidential Medal of Freedom. We see here on the right, the slide shows you Carter giving Iakovos the award. So Iakovos leads the embargo, is one of the leaders of the embargo, and very cleverly maintains good relations with the White House and the governments in Athens. And that, of course, not only is a reflection on Iakovos' important role, but it also crystallizes the significance of the archdiocese in the life of Greek America. In 1988, he continues his wonderful balancing act, as it were. 1988 is the moment in which the Democratic Party chooses Greek American Massachusetts Governor Mike Dukakis as its presidential candidate. And the dilemma is, what will the church do? Well, it's almost a no-brainer for Iakovos. He's going to invite Dukakis to the clergy laity conference. You can see him here on the left slide. Dukakis will address the clergy laity conference in 1988. But when the Republicans hold their convention meeting, Iakovos will accept George Bush's invitation and go and speak to the Republican National Convention as well. He's done that to the Democratic Convention, and he's invited Dukakis to the to clergy laity. So Iakovos balances wonderfully between the two. Embracing modernity as part of his tenure, a very, very important moment is the way that Iakovos supports the ladies' Philoptochos, the philanthropic branch of Greek Orthodoxy. He empowers the ladies' Philoptochos in many ways. He, in a sense, brings the ladies' Philoptochos into the mainstream of the archdiocese's life. The 1990s brings another wave of assimilation. We had the arrival of the Greeks in the 1960s, 1970s. We had somewhat of a revival of ethnicity, but even those Greeks who arrived in the late 60s, early 70s, by the 1990s, the community is now again going through a reinforced assimilation. And now there are more and more demands that the church Americanizes more, uses the Greek language more, thinks about maybe an American orthodoxy. OCL is an organization called Orthodox Christian Laity. It's based in Chicago. And as you can see from this slide, it advocates more of a role for the laity. In other words, democratizing the church in a more American style, some would say Protestant style, and wants a unified, self-governing American Orthodox Church. That's the Orthodox Clergy Laity Organization. Within the church itself, a very, very important Greek-American figure, Charles Moskos, the sociologist, suggests that what the OCL is saying is going to be what's going to happen in the long term. And at the Clergy Laity Conference of 1990, suggests as much in this report submitted to Archbishop Iakovos, which the slide here shows. So the church dominant, but in order to retain its dominance, has got to follow the trend of assimilation that Greek America is going through, because if it doesn't, it won't remain relevant. It'll become some kind of old world church. But in doing so, of course, it's always going to have reactions, because the church always is based on religion. So there's a balancing act. Maybe the theme of this presentation, and I've got very few slides left, maybe the theme of this presentation is the continuous adaptation of the church to the changing face of Greek America. The end of Iakovos, when he underestimates the changes in the 1990s. In the 1990s, heeding the words of Moskos and others, Iakovos is thinking about closer relations with the other Eastern Orthodox churches in America, and in a sense, a distancing from the Patriarchate. But meanwhile, the Patriarchate of Constantinople, which was in a relatively weak position, especially after Athinagoras' death in 1972, was becoming less and less relevant, gains a new lease of life. Because it's got the current ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, who's very dynamic, and secondly, the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War, the beginning of what we know as globalization and increased transnational networks, enhances the role of the Patriarchate. And we have here a 1994 article in the New York Times by Alan Cowell, a journalist who knows the Balkans very well, that suggests as much. The headline is enough. In a vastly changed world, Patriarch sees chances. There's a moment for the ecumenical patriarch to begin to assert itself. But meanwhile, in America, the process of thinking about American Orthodoxy is continuing, and American Orthodox leaders, Iakovos is at the center of the top left slide, meet at the Antiochian Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church of Antioch, that has an important branch in America. It has a retreat in a place called Ligonier, Pennsylvania. They meet here and they take the first steps towards the prospects of unity among the Orthodox churches and relative autonomy from the Patriarchate. That doesn't go down very well with the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, not surprisingly. A wonderful cover of the Greek American magazine Esis that is not published anymore. Vartholomeos Iakovos Oristiki Lixi speculates the magazine, and Bartholomew is actually forcing Iakovos to step down. Interestingly enough, in Athens, the Papandreou government, this is the early 1990s, Greece is involved in the Macedonian issue, not only the language but name issue, the whole package of the Macedonian question, which is so important, I know, also in Australia, Canada, but also in the United States. And Athens wants Iakovos to stay because he can influence Clinton and persuade the United States to stand on Greece's side. But Bartholomew will get his way in 1996, and Iakovos will step down in a spectacular farewell liturgy that takes place in Central Park in Manhattan in 1996. He is by Archbishop Spiriton, who is a traditionalist. Spiriton, I think, misunderstands the situation. He thinks that he's replacing Iakovos, who was pushing modernization too far. So he errs on the side of tradition. There's too much antagonism. There's too many divisions created in the archdiocese. Ironically, one of his major contribution is a report on the future of the Greek language and the way the Greek language can be preserved by a commission headed by Professor John Rassias of Dartmouth College, a nationally renowned linguist here in the United States. But despite that contribution, the rest of Spiriton's leadership of the church is too traditional and too controversial. He is forced to step down in 1999. And I now conclude with my two final slides. One is his replacement is Archbishop Dimitrios, a theologian who is in charge of the church. Dimitrios calms the waters. He steadies the church after the tensions created by Spiriton and leads the church through the September 11 crisis, but is credited or is said to not have managed so well the issue of the rebuilding of the St. Nicholas Church, which was destroyed when the Twin Towers went down in 9/11. So he is forced to step down in 2019 because of the delays and issues associated with building this shrine, which, despite the fact that it costs the Archbishop his tenure, although he was at a time in which he was going to retire, it's a sign of the self-assuredness of Greek Orthodoxy that they decide that St. Nicholas will not just be a Greek Orthodox church, but will become a national shrine open to all Americans. As a historian, I am the last person who should speak about the future, but I do believe that with the impressive leadership of the current Archbishop Elpidophoros, we might have a situation in which the Greek Orthodox Church is moving towards American Orthodoxy the way Iakovos was envisioning, but will probably remain an American Orthodoxy with Greek Orthodoxy dominant and with very close ties to the ecumenical patriarchate. All my this presentation, which is based on my book on Greek Orthodoxy, would not have been written with the help of the people that you see in this slide, especially the Jaharis Family Foundation, who very, very generously gave me a grant to write this book, and everyone else here who contributed. That is my presentation. I will take my PowerPoint down and bring myself up to answer any questions you may have. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Kitroeff, for that quite informative presentation. You did cover a lot of ground, and it's quite a massive topic, and I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions from the audience. Let me just kickstart the questioning. And I noticed at the moment you're working on a book on the history of AHEPA in the US. Can you say something about AHEPA and church relations in the US? Were often people members of both organizations? Was there ever any tension or collaboration between the two?
That's the relations between AHEPA and the Greek Orthodox Church in America are a very, very important topic. And to understand that is to understand the way Greek America functions. And in many ways, I would say it confirms the significance of the church. When AHEPA is established in 1922, it's established in order to defend the Greek Americans from the xenophobia and the Ku Klux Klan and racism. And in order to appear American, AHEPA acquires a Masonic structure. It's got its rituals, and it talks about religion, but somehow underplays Greek Orthodoxy. Locally, however, many AHEPA members are members of their parishes. And gradually, especially in the 1930s onwards, when Athinagoras comes, and AHEPA has succeeded in persuading most Greek Americans to acquire American citizenship, learn English, become assimilated. And now AHEPA doesn't want to become a victim of its own success and stop functioning. It needs to find other ways to function and operate. It becomes more openly connected with the church. And from the 1930s onwards, the relations are very close. Interestingly enough, to get into the minutiae, occasionally you see there's a little bit of tension, especially with Archbishop Iakovos sometimes. But on the whole, AHEPA and the church have very, very close relations, and it's a kind of synergistic relationship. It was very significant that when Archbishop Dimitrios was forced to step down in 2019, I had a sense that, let's say the National Herald newspaper, the Ethnikos Kyrix, the daily Greek language newspaper that is based in New York, the Ethnikos Kyrix had criticized Dimitrios and appeared to be pleased with the changes happening in the archdiocese, and so did many other elements in the Greek American community. AHEPA, to its credit, issued a very, very warm, respectful statement of gratitude to Archbishop Dimitrios, an outstanding, it was the most clear sense of gratitude the Greek Americans expressed. And then with Elpidophoros, became very, very supportive of Elpidophoros. And coincidentally, they were visiting Constantinople at the time Elpidophoros was appointed, and met him even before he came to the United States. And from then on, their relations are very, 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 very close. So initial distance, increasing synergy.
You mentioned before that Iakovos, who had quite a long tenure, he was very good at supporting balancing acts. How did he, when Greece was under the rule of the colonels, under the junta, what was his position then? Because surely there would have been pressure from Greek Americans to apply pressure on the regime. And how did he handle that relationship when Greece was under dictatorship?
So, unfortunately, at the time, the Greek American leadership had been assimilated into America, were very close to American, they were very conservative, they were close to the American Cold War thinking. So the leadership of Greek America were quite sympathetic or tolerant towards the junta, and that includes AHEPA. Iakovos stood out again in its own way. I could summarize it by saying it wasn't a question of what Iakovos's attitude was to the junta, but the issue was what was the junta's attitude towards Iakovos? Let me explain. Iakovos was initially supportive of the junta, and in 1960 he had already planned a clergy laity conference, this biannual conference that the archdiocese holds. He had already planned one for 1968 before the colonels took over in 1967. He doesn't change his plans. The clergy laity conference takes place in 1968, and in all intents and purposes, it appears that Iakovos's relations with the colonels is quite close. However, the way that Iakovos wanted to become in the same way that he wanted to become the person in between the White House and Athens, the governments in Athens, he also wanted to be the person intervening between the colonels in Greece, Karamanlis in Paris, the king in London, and the State Department, and was advising the colonels to democratize and The colonels did not heed Iakovos's advice, and in the summer of 1973, let me say, I suppose, fed up with the fact that the colonels were not listening to his advice, Iakovos writes a letter to the State Department calling the dictatorship a tyranny, which was quite a change from his attitude before that. That letter was leaked to the New York Times and came out and was made public. Of course, Iakovos was quite taken aback by the fact that this became public. But gradually, from 1973 onwards, he became distant from the colonels. So it was a complicated relationship.
A question here from Thea Vosnidis. With such a long history of use of English in intermarriage, has there been any missionary movement to seek converts to Greek Orthodoxy in the US?
Could you repeat the last? Has there been any?
Has there been any missionary movement to seek converts to Greek Orthodoxy?
Yes. I mean, that's almost a topic in itself. It's very interesting. There's two things to be said about that. First of all, because of the issue of mixed marriages, the fact that Greek Orthodox will marry outside the church was for many, many years seen as a sign of a negative sign, a sign that Greek Orthodoxy might be weakening. The church has now changed its attitude and considered the fact that you have marriages outside the church is a way through conversion to enhance the numbers of members of the church. So the church is encouraging persons engaged in mixed marriages to pay special attention to the possibilities of converting their spouses or their spouses becoming part of the church. There are a couple of studies made already about converts to the Greek Orthodox Church and other Eastern Orthodox churches, and that's an important phenomenon, and very interestingly offsets this problem of mixed marriages, because there is an increasing attention paid to converts who become Greek Orthodox, and they're certainly welcomed in the church. And it might be, if the church can manage it, it could actually work to the advantages of Greek Orthodoxy. It's a big, important topic in the life of the church.
Question/comment from Nikos Papasiliadis. Are we entering a new era of respectability, and is there any parallel that can be drawn with Australia?
Interestingly, the comparisons are so important. We do so little in comparing diaspora communities. There's very little done comparing the Americans in the United States with Canada, let alone the Greeks in Australia, which I would like to embark on such a project. Era of respectability in the United States. It's very clear. I like the question because I was aware that I was saying there was an era of respectability in the 50s. Then there was another one in the 90s. There's a continuous entering of the mainstream in America. Can America be seen as the model for the Greeks in Australia and Canada? Will the experience of the Greeks in Australia be a reflection of the experiences of the Greeks in America? Well, there's one difference, I think, and I stand corrected, and I would like actually to throw the question back to everyone listening. The United States, as far as I'm concerned, is a more assimilation-oriented society than Australia and Canada, as far as I know. The Americans will let you have your ethnic parade down Fifth Avenue, whether you're Greek or Irish or anything else, but ultimately you're American with some kind of ethnic heritage. So I think the rates of assimilation in America, because of the way that America treats ethnicity, the ones in America are going to be faster. So in that sense, I think ethnicity will be a more will have greater staying power in Australia. And what you might have is you might have respectability and entering the mainstream, but retaining a stronger ethnic identity than the one that the Greek Americans have. Question mark at the end.
Thank you for that. It is a long discussion, and we also have regional followers here. One from Geelong. Did Archbishop Athenagoras influence Truman on policy involving Greece in any way?
It can Archbishop Athenagoras.
Did he influence President Truman on policy involving Greece in any way?
Yes. I think there are a couple of books on the way that the Truman Doctrine used religion for foreign policy. I think there was a dialectical relationship. In other words, Truman was looking for somebody to offset the influence of Russian Orthodoxy. And in that sense, I think he saw a wonderful candidate in Athinagoras. For sure, Athinagoras must have influenced Truman at the time, and it is not a coincidence, of course, and it's kind of like the question is very apropos. We have the Truman Doctrine in 1947, March 12th, and we have already there discussions about the ecumenical patriarchate and whether Athinagoras will go to Constantinople. But the bottom line is, I think that the United States conducts its own policy based on its own interests, and the extent to which things like the Greek American lobby or personalities such as Athinagoras can influence are not marginal would be the wrong word. I think they can contribute somehow, but the core direction of U.S. foreign policy is based on their interests rather than influence from within the United States by Greek Americans or Greek Orthodox.
A question from Juliana Harbandido. What were the reasons the ecumenical patriarchate in 1908 gave diaspora churches to the Church of Greece?
Yes, thank you. The so-called tomos. It's not clear. 1908, of course, was the time that there was the Young Turk Revolution. There was a great deal of upheaval going on in Istanbul itself and within the ecumenical patriarchate. Ecumenical Patriarch Joachim at the time was trying to sort out his own views on whether he would be backing the great idea or finding a way in which Orthodoxy could be accommodated with the Greek, with the new realities in the Ottoman Empire in the wake of the rise of the Young Turks. So I think the Greeks in America, remember at that time, the numbers were not that big by 1908. I think the Greeks in America were just something too far away and almost a distraction for the ecumenical patriarchate. So they decided that it might be better for the Greek church to gain the authority and responsibility over the administration of the Greek Church in America, which was something, of course, that Mataksakis reversed. In 1922, he reestablished the authority of the ecumenical patriarchate. But it's not I haven't found, there's no smoking gun is definitely the wrong metaphor to use in this case, but there's no, haven't found something that articulates that very clearly. I suspect the answer is in the archives of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Istanbul. There's no clear information on the American side.
We might finish with a final question. In most Western societies, there's a long-term trend of secularization, of non-religious affiliation. How's the Greek Orthodox Church in America dealing with that and responding to that?
How much time have we got left? We could talk. It's a great topic again, because I'm going to answer. There's two things that are happening at the same time in America. Yes, there's a secularization of American society. Not only a secularization, but somehow a fragmentation of spirituality, let me say it that way, with people looking for other forms of alternative forms of spirituality, many of them based in Asia, and other forms. There's clearly that documentation going on, and there's a reduction of maybe the significance of churches in many parts of American society, and this either secularization or alternative forms of spirituality. However, religion in the American mainstream as a narrative, as a vocabulary, remains very, very strong. Invocations of God, the "in God we trust" on the dollar note. That remains very present in the official way in which America sees itself. And in terms of the Greek American community, I would say that the secularization is only partial, because in a sense, Greek Orthodoxy presents itself as a form of Greek identity. The fact that, of course, the generations become more and more distant from Greece, the language becomes less and less used. Greek Orthodoxy becomes the way that people can attach to their Greek heritage. So to that extent, it might be not an ideal way to be religious, but it is still an affiliation with Greek Orthodoxy. So to that extent, the secularization is present, but it's not. The church doesn't consider it a clear threat at the moment. It doesn't discuss these things publicly, at least.
Okay. I think we've gone a bit over time. And Professor Kitroeff, thanks once again. It's been great having you. Thanks for taking part in this series. And hopefully one day we'll see you in the flesh in Melbourne at the Greek Centre. Yeah,
I'd love that. And thank you so much for inviting me today. Pleasure.
Thank you. And just a reminder, next week we have a break, and we return in the fortnight with Professor Tom Papadimitriou. Thank you everyone for following us.